Listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon. Peruvian President Pedro Castillo has been removed in what some suspect to be a Western-backed coup. Also, a U.S.-Africa summit is being held in D.C., and the president of China is visiting Saudi Arabia. Joining us to talk about these stories and more, we've got Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, a historian, and a researcher. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
People's Dispatch reports the coup against Pedro Castillo was led by an odious right wing that refused to accept the people's aspiration for a progressive project. I'll add this. Our dear friend, Dr. Wilmer Leon, always says, the hegemon does not go quietly into the night. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, certainly the opinion that yourself and Wilmer Leon have expressed has been echoed in the hemisphere by President Lopez Obrador of Mexico, incoming president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, the former president of Bolivia, speaking of Evo Morales. As they see things, you had a left-leaning president in Peru, speaking of Mr. Castillo, who was sabotaged. In fact, he's now under arrest on a military base outside of the capital, Lima. And the opponents and detractors of the now detained president argue that this was a simple case of mismanagement, misrule, incompetence, and corruption. But as the aforementioned leaders in the hemisphere suggest, those kinds of charges have been routinely used against left-leaning presidents. Recall that Lula da Silva himself was detained for a number of months before winning the election just weeks ago. Recall as well that there was a similar kind of coup against Evo Morales of Bolivia a few years ago. And recall that as we speak, the former president and current president of Argentina, speaking of Madame de Kirchner, has just been convicted. She claims that this is an attempt to derail the possibility of her returning to the highest office in the land. So in any case, I think that there is something to the opinion that you've expressed, that Wilmer Leon has expressed, that again has been echoed by left-leaning leaders in the hemisphere. And to that end, do not allow me to let this moment pass without talking about something that should be of consequence and moment to your audience. I'm speaking of the ongoing campaign to destabilize President Lopez Obrador in Mexico. In the current issue of Foreign Affairs, the elite journal published on the posh Upper East Side of Manhattan, there is a scorching attack on Mr. Lopez Obrador. That has been echoed in the pages of the New York Times, speaking of their op-ed writer, Bret Stephens, who has long-standing ties to the right wing in Mexico. And given the unfortunate history between Mexico and the United States, with the United States waging war on Mexico in the 1840s, seizing California, now purportedly the fourth largest economy on planet Earth, we should take what's happening in Peru very seriously. We should take Mr. Lopez Obrador's comments very seriously as well about Peru.
You know, something just rung a bell briefly. We have reported here that the Mexico had not a protest, a rally in support of AMLO. Upwards of 1 million people showed up, and the government was talking about the many, things that they've done to help the people, et cetera, here over the last week. And it just dawned on me, that's what they're doing. They're pushing back against what will likely be some kind of a regime change move by the U.S. empire. Does that sound reasonable?
I'm afraid that it does. And recall that we were talking earlier this week. I mentioned that a particular emblem, as Washington sees it, of its security is the fact that it has on its borders neighbors who are either friendly like Canada or that have been bludgeoned like Mexico. And Mr. Lopez Obrador is trying to break out of that model And as Wilmer Leon suggests, inevitably there's pushback.
Here's a very important story. I'd like to get your thoughts on it. U.S. to hold African summit to deepen relationship, address shared challenges. Now, that's what the U.S. says, deepen relationship, address shared challenges. My thoughts immediately go to AFRICOM, and that is a challenge, but it's not shared. Your thoughts on the upcoming Africa summit?
Well, it's a sign of desperation. It's a sign of the fact that the United States is becoming ever more hysterical about the closer relations between China and Africa in particular. Keep in mind that what has boosted the United States and its North Atlantic allies into the pole position on planet Earth has been precisely the exploitation of African resources, the exploitation of African people, speaking of the unlimited African slave trade. And this upcoming summit in Washington, D.C. is an attempt by Uncle Sam to play catch-up ball, to try to nip China at the pass. And ultimately, of course, there's the mailed fist, AFRICOM, as you mentioned.
The other thing I think that is important, the U.S., and if I could get you to comment on this, the U.S. empire in its, grandest form has AFRICOM, and it's working to, separate China, to block to block Africa from being able to do business with Russia and China. Your thoughts on the relationship between, or shall I say, the humongous fractures between these African former colonies of France and current day France, what's going on, Mali, et cetera. They are pushing France away, and I think the U.S. is taking notice of that also.
Well, the restiveness in what used to be called in the bad old days French West Africa is a direct result of the rise of China, which means that Senegal and Mali and Chad and the other nations of the former French Empire now have options. They are not locked in to this abusive relationship with France. Recall that Mali has just shown French troops the door. They've just asked them to leave their territory, that they're not serving a useful purpose. And once again, reference here, the recent trip to Washington of French President Macron, and certainly on the agenda in his talks with U.S. President Mr. Biden, were attempts to tighten relations between Washington and Paris so that Africa can be more usefully exploited. I would like to say, and I would like to think, that those bad old days are over.
Moving just a bit north, President Xi, China reports that Xi's Saudi trip to open up new prospects for China-Arab ties. China's intensive head of state diplomacy is set to continue in December, and this time the focus of attention is Saudi Arabia and the broader Arab world. President Xi Jinping arrived in Saudi Arabia Wednesday afternoon to attend the first China-Arab States Summit and China Gulf Cooperation Council Summit. I do remember Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. I saw pictures of when he met with the Gulf Cooperation Council, and they were, receiving him with smiles and handshakes. It seems that the same thing's going on with China. And my understanding is they've signed upwards of $30 billion in deals. I think this is a very important meeting. Your thoughts on this?
Very important indeed. And once again, I'm afraid to say you cannot separate what's going on in Saudi Arabia as we speak from the aforementioned subject, speaking of U.S. relations with the African continent, because Saudi Arabia, as you know, sits just across the Red Sea from the Horn of Africa, speaking of Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti, just to name a few. And Washington is very upset with Saudi Arabia. Washington feels that the Saudis stabbed Mr. Biden in the back when they refused to play ball with regard to oil prices just before the November elections. There is talk in the international community of the Saudis moving away from the so-called petrodollar. That is to say that you have to accumulate U.S. currency in order to buy the lifeblood of your economy, which is petroleum, which is barrels of oil. Supposedly, China and the Saudis will deal in the Chinese currency and then the Saudi currency. This is nothing new. Recall that Russia is trading with China increasingly with rubles and the renminbi, trading increasingly with India with the rupee and the ruble. And a footnote also to our African discussion, Ghana, which is under enormous pressure from the international piranhas and vultures, speaking of the International Monetary Fund. Ghana used to be called the Gold Coast. It still has a considerable amount of gold, and it's increasingly trying to use gold to purchase oil as opposed to dollars. As pointed out by a writer in the Financial Times of London just a few days ago, this is also very significant because it shows how the international community, even smaller countries like Ghana, whose population is probably about 10 or 15 million, are increasingly trying to readjust and move away from the dollar-centric economy, which is bad news for Uncle Sam.
Staying on China, the issue of China's relationship with the EU is very important in that the U.S., as we know, the U.S. empire is, the confrontation, shall we call it, with Russia right now is part of a greater confrontation. It is their ability their inclination to attempt to hold on to a unipolar world that has already passed and to confront both China and Russia to knock them down to size. And therefore, the U.S. empire is once again the unipolar power. However, there seems to be some issues with the EU going along. Here's an article. Scholz's remarks encourage Europe not to misjudge China's rise, blindly follow the U.S. experts. It appears that a company, my understanding is, I believe 38% of BMW's sales were in China. It seems that there is some balking going on at economic suicide part 2 for the EU. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, Chancellor Scholz, as you well know, just a few weeks ago was in Beijing with a plane load of German business executives. It seems as if Berlin is willing to play ball with Uncle Sam with regard to Russia, but it's not willing to necessarily play ball with regard to China. This is totally understandable given the close and tight trade relations between China and the Federal Republic of Germany. In that regard, I would hope and I trust that an enterprising journalist and or investigator will look at the recent arrest in Berlin and in Germany of these supposed coup plotters who had ties to neo-Nazis, who supposedly were going to try to do ill, shall we say euphemistically, to Chancellor Scholz. I would hope that Uncle Sam was not involved, but given the fact that Germany is festooned with U.S. military bases, it seems to me that we cannot rule that out altogether. But before I make that statement definitively, I would hope that a journalist of repute would look into this a bit more closely and carefully.
What do you think about the visit of Emmanuel Macron? He came to Washington. He dined on shrimp and lobster with President Biden. He implored him to change the direction of industry, which is from the EU directly to the United States. And it seems that he was sent out with empty pockets and empty rhetoric. What do you think about that, and how do you think that affects things going forward? Will the ruling elite in the EU actually do anything, or will they just put their head down and take it?
Right now, it's difficult to say. What I mean is that, as your comments suggest, there are legitimate beefs and disputes between France and the United States, between the European Union and the United States, with regard to the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which provides subsidies to U.S. corporations, which then would encourage Western European corporations to set up facilities in North America in order to become beneficiaries of the subsidies from Washington. Mr. Macron and his class are very upset about that. But at the same time, there is a so-called Trade and Technology Council that unites Brussels and Washington, that unites the European Union and the United States of America. Increasingly, the United States and the European Union are becoming ever more hysterical about the rise of China. and they're seeking to band together in order to confront that rise. In fact, there was an article in the New York Times the other day about how they're seeking to ally, particularly with regard to steel and aluminum, so as to unite their paltry forces so as to block China in those two important realms. So on the one hand, you have conflict between Brussels and Washington, reference my previous comment about the Inflation Reduction Act and the subsidies that Mr. Macron sees as inimical to European interests. On the other hand, you have cooperation, not only cooperation with regard to China, but cooperation, as we know, with regard to confronting Russia. So it's difficult to say which trend will win out. Probably it turns on how fast and how rapidly China ascends in the global political economy. And right now, it's ascending with hurricane speed.
Here's something important, and I tell you why I think this is important. In talking to some people who are very familiar with the political dynamics in Taiwan, you're very familiar with the elections that happened a week or two ago, wherein the ruling party took a thrashing, shall we say. I was told that that this was mostly based on domestic economic issues, and one of the issues was that people in Taiwan feel that TSMC, the big chip maker, that is that's their thing. That is the center of their economy. That's what they're proud of. And that they were unhappy about this. CNN reports TSMC ups its Arizona chip-making investment to $40 billion ahead of Biden's visit. They're announcing Tuesday that it's building a second semiconductor factory in Arizona and raising its investment there from $12 billion to $40 billion. And I was told that the people of Taiwan are not happy with this development. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, clearly, because what that means is that those well-paying jobs, instead of being allocated to Taiwan, will be allocated to Arizona. The importance of what TSMC is doing in Arizona was validated when Mr. Biden flew out to Arizona for the official opening or beginning of the opening of this plant, as well as Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, which is heavily dependent upon TSMC for chips, and right now is in a kind of quandary because the hawks in Washington are now demanding that many of the corporations that are so heavily invested in China, such as Apple, for example, that they take a haircut, that they try to decouple their production facilities from the People's Republic of China. This has led to a mad scramble on the part of Apple, is trying to compensate not only by opening facilities in Vietnam and opening facilities in India, but also this plant in Arizona, which is why Tim Cook showed up alongside Mr. Biden. I would point your audience to the recent book, Chip Wars, by the Tufts University professor, TUFTS University professor, Chris Miller, which goes into some detail about how this battle over who controls chips is going to be one of the pivotal battles of the 21st century.
I certainly think that the Europeans are going to be concerned because, let's face it, if the U.S. gets to corner the chip market, they will certainly use that to, that's another powerful force they have to twist the arms of European leaders. I think the European leaders are finding out that they're not members of NATO, that they're prisoners of NATO. We've been talking with Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author. He's a historian. Thank you very much, Dr. Horne.